In this video, I will provide you with a few methods on how you can replace the bottom wall framing plate on a concrete slab where you have anchor bolts like these in the way. Now, the anchor bolts usually create a problem because the walls, when they are built, are usually placed over the anchor bolts, built on the ground, assembled on the ground, then placed over the anchor bolts, or the bottom framing plate is bolted to the foundation and then the walls are framed. And it's one of those things that will be difficult to replace sometimes. Method number one is probably the easiest way to replace the sill plate, but a method that might not be approved by your local building authorities. And that would simply be to cut a notch in the bottom plate and then slide it underneath the wall framing studs, and you have replaced it. Now, the first thing or something I'd like to mention here would be to make sure that you do the best you can to cut the notch as small as you can, because most engineers, I believe, require a 1/16 inch minimum distance between the bolt and the wood, and that of course is for expanding and contracting purposes. So I would say at the most an 1/8 of an inch is going to be the maximum that you're going to want to see between the wall framing plate and the anchor bolts. And again, I don't recommend cutting it up tight. I don't think it would be a problem with a notch. It might be a bigger problem with a hole that's drilled. But try and keep it within an 1/8 of an inch, or an 1/8 of an inch maximum distance. After that, go ahead and install the nut and the washer, but don't use a round washer if that's what you had before. You're going to need something with a little more support. A round washer here wouldn't really do that, wouldn't work well. Use a square washer, and these can be found at most lumber yards and home improvement centers. Now, you can always, I'm just going to kind of throw this out there as something you can do or not do. Sometimes you might be looking for a little more strength, and if that's the case, you can always get some metal that is the thickness of one of these washers and maybe the width of one of the washers, and then you can cut it into pieces, maybe a 9-inch or a 10-inch piece. So if this is 2.5 inches wide, the washer, then maybe you could cut a piece of metal 2.5 inches wide and maybe 8 inches long if you're looking for a little more support. The reason for the washers will be to keep the wall framing plate from separating from the foundation. And with this notch, it might be providing you with a weak spot by cutting a piece of metal a little larger, installing something a little larger. You're probably going to get a little more structural support for the framing plate. Now, one more thing, this is going to be important. You will need, wherever you cut the wall framing plate, you need to install another anchor bolt unless you already have one installed. The minimum distance from the break or the cut, the separation plate in the framing plates, is 12 inches. And you could actually have a situation where your framing plate you have walls that are framed and the breaks are nowhere near the anchor bolts. And if that's the case, I'll leave it up to you. This is something that would be required by an engineer. It's usually called out on a set of building plans. It'll be called out for the anchor bolts to be no further than 12 inches away from any break. And of course, that would include breaks at the corner. So keep that in mind when you are figuring out where to place where to cut the bottom plate for the repair. For example, let's just say that the damage is right here and going this way. This is the end of the damage, and I hope that's let me just shift over here. Hope that's not out of the picture. Let's just say that the damage is here, and then you go ahead and you cut your plate here and then replace the damage plate, well, now you're going to need an anchor bolt on each side because you're about 16 inches away from the other anchor bolt. So if this is the case, while you're planning on where to cut the bottom plate, it might not be a bad idea to go a little further to the next anchor bolt, cut it within 12 inches, and then replace the framing plate. And then if you're going to do it, if you're going to make the engineers happy, then you would install another anchor bolt, and you'd probably need to use some type of an epoxy system for that, which could be a pain in the butt for do-it-yourselfers that don't have a bunch of tools. The next method used will be to cut a new framing plate and create a center by doing some measurements on where the holes will be drilled. In this one here, you will be drilling the holes in the framing plate and cutting the bottoms of the wall studs. Now, I do have another video. I'll put a link in here somewhere to where you can access that on how to support load-bearing and non-load-bearing walls while you are making these kinds of repairs. So on this one here, you are going to need to cut the bottom of the studs, and the framing plate will actually slide over the anchor bolts, and so that it can be dropped into place. So when figuring out where to cut the wall studs, you can just make sure that you measure the top of the anchor bolt. If the anchor bolt is 2 inches above the concrete and you have 1.5 inch framing plate, then make sure that you have the wall studs cut at least 3.5 inches, 3 5/8, or 3 3/4, something like that, so that you can slide the new framing plate into position so that it will go over the anchor bolts without a notch. After that, secure the bottom plate with your nuts and your washers, and then you can install a new wall stud on and attach it to each one of the ones that you cut. And if you are going to make a repair, most repairs, you're not going to rip out all of the drywall. You're not going to tear all of the stucco and the siding off. A lot of times you're only going to be going up about 2 or 3 feet and then cutting a section of the drywall out and then leaving everything above in place. If that's the case, then you might be able to get away with attaching a board to the wall stud. And this could be a piece of plywood. This could be another framing stud or something cut from a framing stud. And you would need to put a filler block in there. And I was thinking about this, how you can't just nail in. If you have a 3-inch piece here and you start nailing into it, there's a very good chance it's going to split. This might be a good time to where you could use some glue or some type of an adhesive to where you could nail the supporting stud or the new stud into place, and then put some type of an adhesive and then slide this in here, and then maybe a few nails or screws. But once you start nailing something like this could be a problem. Then I was thinking about using some type of framing straps or angle brackets, something like a Simpson A35. And I'm thinking that you're going to be back to the same scenario. You could split the heck out of some of this stuff. So a small block might do with only a few nails, and then of course you'd be focusing on the main support would be the new supporting stud. Here's the last method in the video, and this would be to simply install a framing plate or a couple of framing plates, make your repair, and then to make up the difference, install a couple of plates or use some scrap plywood to make up the difference. It's not going to be uncommon to actually make your cuts. It's going to be difficult to make the cuts perfectly square. And if that's the case, you might the stud over here might require a 3/4 inch piece of plywood. This one might require a 1/2 inch piece of plywood, and this one over here might require a 3/4 inch piece. Then just cut a few scrap pieces in there, and don't be afraid to use wedges. Drive some wedges in between the gaps to make sure they're filled, and maybe use some adhesive on this. Put a little bit of adhesive down, put the wedges in so that they don't slide out later. And again, can you fasten the wedges with some type of a staple or a finish nail? Yes, but a larger nail might actually split the wedges. So that is it for the video. I hope that it helps, and don't forget to check out some of our other videos also.